Hi everyone, in this episode of Versus, I'm going to be matching the Aegis Hammerhead up against the RSI Perseus. And this video is going to be for anyone who's interested in putting together an escort fleet and wanted to know what their options are and how those ships compare to each other. There's several ships that are more than capable of fulfilling that role, with three of the best being the Hammerhead, the Perseus, and the Liberator. Each one of those ships brings their own distinctive qualities to the table, but for this video I'm only going to be focusing on the Hammerhead and the Perseus. This is going to make for a very interesting comparison because these ships weren't meant to be competitors in the traditional sense. They were meant to complement each other's strengths and weaknesses, and if all three of them were used in the same battlefield, they could end up being a force to be reckoned with. So I'm going to see how the Hammerhead and the Perseus match up when it comes to the role that they play, their crew sizes, how they could be used in combat, and what the pros and cons are for each of them. Now, I'm going to start things off by taking a look at the Hammerhead. And this ship is designed to be one giant mobile weapons platform that's covered in turrets. Four of them ring the outer periphery of the vessel, and has one more that's mounted towards the rear of the ship, with one last one being located on its ventral side. Each one of these 6 turrets are equipped with 4 size 4 weapons. The pilot can't operate any of them, but they do have access to 32 size 3 missiles. There's only 2 differences that exist between these ships when it comes to their components loadouts, and it's that the Perseus has 2 large fuel intakes, while the Hammerhead has 2 medium-sized fuel intakes. And the other thing is that the Perseus has a large quantum fuel tank, while the Hammerhead's is medium-sized. But these 2 things could easily be altered at any time, so I wouldn't place too much stock with the way things are right now. One of the advantages to having the Hammerhead in game is that it's been able to prove itself in a trial by combat many times over. It's faced off against hordes of smaller ships, and it's been sent to take on the Idris. And depending on what side of the law you stand on, you may have already ended up using it to take on a Javelin. So we have a good idea by now how it's going to stand when confronted with both of these kinds of situations. It's officially labeled as being a gunship, and as long as you have the numbers to run it, it's always going to be a welcome addition to any battlefield. The Hammerhead has an interior that's just as impressive looking as the outside of the ship. All of the hallways that line the Hammerhead's interior have the classic rounded shape that Aegis is famous for, and it has all the standard amenities that are needed to maintain a crew of 9 people for an extended period of time. The captain's quarters are very militaristically functional in how it's laid out, as an office, an adjoining bed, and a washroom. The barracks has enough bunk space for 8 people, and has 4 additional rooms that connect to it. 2 of them are showers, while the other 2 are bathrooms. The galley is one large open area that houses a big communal table that everyone can sit, eat, and socialize at, and has a good-sized pantry that's located around the corner and in the back. The bridge is uniquely positioned on the underside of the vessel, and you have to take a lift down to get to it. It only has 2 stations on the flight deck. One of them is for the pilot, and the other set aside for the co-pilot. It has a modestly sized drop-down ramp that's big enough to hold 40 SCUs of cargo, and a vehicle that's rover-sized or smaller. One of the best support vehicles you could bring with you is an Ursa medevac. The medevac gives the ship an internal spawn point and can heal Tier 3 injuries, which is something that's almost too good to pass up. An alternative choice would be the Fury, which could end up being a very effective piece of EVA gear, which in a lot of ways is how I tend to look at this ship. Or it could be used as a boarding vessel for a lone crewman that has either delusions of grandeur or a serious death wish. The Hammerhead's role is to act as an anti-fighter screen that you'd use to take out smaller, faster ships. Currently, the biggest threat to a larger vessel is anything that's small and agile enough to get into its blind spot, and from there it can keep firing on the larger ship till they end up destroying it. And the Hammerhead is going to be the best counter to that, next to actually having your own fleet of small fighters. And the only real downside to this ship is that it requires more people to run it than your average captain usually has access to. It's not going to be a good ship to use for the daily grind. And that's because the amount of people it requires doesn't match the operational cost or the amount of money that it would earn through doing missions. And the Hammerhead is also going to be a social vessel, which means that it's going to need someone to coordinate the crew by calling out targets and making sure that the pilot is always turning the Hammerhead so that its guns keep the enemy in their sights. The only other criticism that people have had about the Hammerhead is with the cutout section that's in the middle of the ship and just behind its front end. And the issue is that it could have been used as anything other than empty space, and to make things even worse, it even has a set of windows so you can look out into it just so you can be constantly reminded that there's nothing there. And that brings me to the Perseus. The Perseus is going to be most effective when it's used to take on medium and large targets, or anything else that's unlucky enough to fly in front of its guns. It's also designed to be able to lend its firepower to the rest of the fleet when taking down capital class sized enemies. And its oversized guns, heavy armor, and ballistics payload are going to let it stand toe to toe with enemy ships and shrug off their attacks long after its shields have been taken down. It has 2 large turrets that have a pair of size 7 weapons each. It also has 2 auto remote turrets that have a pair of size 3 ballistic Gatling guns. And the good thing about them is that they can fire automatically, so that's 2 less gunner positions you don't have to worry about. And the pilot is going to have access to 20 size 5 missiles, which is actually kind of impressive. One solid advantage that this ship has over the Hammerhead is that it's going to require a lot less people to fully utilize the entire scope of its offensive capabilities. And it's only going to need a skeleton crew of 3 people to fly it and operate all of its turrets, and that's going to be a huge plus in its favor for a lot of people. When it comes to the total crew size, I'm not going to count having an engineering staff because that aspect of the game is still being developed. But I think it would be safe to say that whatever that number is, it would end up being the same for both ships. So there's not going to be an advantage or disadvantage when it comes to that aspect of gameplay for either one of them. They've already listed the Perseus as having a max speed of 92, and I haven't seen anything about what its maneuverability is supposed to be, but we can use what we already know about the other gunships to guess what it's going to be like. The designers have been very vocal in the past about how a gunship should handle, and the idea that previous gunships were built around was that they're not meant to be fast or agile. They were made for area denial and to let the enemy come to them, not the other way around. And so based on that, I'm thinking the Perseus is going to end up being noticeably less maneuverable than the Hammerhead, and it's most likely going to have a slow acceleration rate. But they have made more than a few references as to how well armored it's supposed to be. In fact, they gave every indication that this ship is going to have very thick armor. Heavy armor means that it's going to be able to soak up a lot of damage even after its shields have been taken down. It also has all the amenities and ship functions that are needed to keep its crew happy for an extended period of time. It has a captain's quarters, mess hall, cargo bay, crew quarters, and a torpedo bay. The Perseus can carry 50 SCUs of cargo or anything that's rover-sized or smaller, and the obvious choice for a vehicle to go with would once again be the Ursa Medevac for all the same reasons. So when it comes to cargo and vehicle storage, the Perseus and the Hammerhead seem to be very similar to one another. There are a few downsides to this ship that people should be made aware of, and the first is that the pilot is not going to be able to operate either of its turrets. I know that when I fly a ship like this, I want to have the most kinetic experience that I can, so I want to be the one who gets to use one of those turrets. But the captain is almost always going to be the one that ends up having to pilot the ship. You could luck out and find someone who's willing to fly it for you, but let's face it, being able to fire those huge guns is going to be one of the most coveted positions on this ship. And despite what you might think, most people are going to mentally check out the second that you tell them that's not the position that you want them for. And if you can't find anyone to be the pilot, then it's going to be up to you to fly it, which is, based on my experience with other large ships, going to be what happens most of the time. Another thing is that the devs have already showed us with the Redeemer and the Star Fury how they're going to end up balancing the Perseus's weapons. The guns on its turrets are custom-made size 7s, and you can use the Inferno and the Ion, which also have a single bespoke size 7 weapon, as a good example to go by for how the devs would end up balancing the Perseus's turrets. And since it's a standalone weapon, they can alter its DPS, range, rate of fire, and cooling rate without affecting any of the other size 7 guns, so they could end up doing whatever they want to it. They could also, much like with the Redeemer, choose to slow down the turret's turning speed, and the slower they make it, the less effective it would be at hitting smaller ships, which is what they may end up doing so that it doesn't compete with the Hammerhead as being an anti-fighter screen. And yet the final issue with the Perseus that I haven't seen a lot of people talk about is that all of its guns fire ballistic rounds, so it's going to have a finite amount of ammunition. I know the ammo boxes are going to help with this, but until that's in game, having limited ammunition is going to continue to be an issue that needs to be dealt with. And as I said before, its turret-mounted weapons are built into the ship, so you're not going to be able to swap them out for anything else. It's going to be very interesting to see how many of these balancing techniques they're going to end up using, and I'm looking forward to revisiting this matchup after the Perseus makes the leap from being a concept to a flight-ready ship. So if you're putting together an escort fleet, or you're just interested in either the Hammerhead or the Perseus, I think that it's going to be good for you to know what their differences are so that you can pick something that's going to be the best fit for your particular type of playstyle. So to summarize all of this, the Hammerhead would be used to act as an anti-fighter screen that's going to be ideal for taking out smaller threats. It's going to require a larger crew, and it's going to need a captain that isn't afraid to be front and center coordinating every one of its actions. So if you know a lot of people and you're a social gamer, then this would be the better choice for you. While the Perseus would use its concentrated firepower to focus down larger vessels and more heavily armored targets. It's going to be able to deal a lot of damage and take a lot in return. So if you want a brawler that requires less people to run it, then this is going to be the one that you should go with. Well, that's going to be it for this episode of Versus. I've been your host, Law of the West. Thanks for watching, and take care.